Our topic today is the lost Middle Kingdom of Francia. Lyon today is the third largest city in France after Paris and Marseille, which is down south on the Mediterranean coast. But Lyon hasn't always been part of France. The city was only incorporated in France back in 1312, so not all that long ago, by King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. The epithet the fair, la belle in French, means the beautiful or the handsome. It does not mean or imply that his dealings with everyone were fair, and they weren't. He was a hard-nosed opportunist, and one of his other nicknames was the Iron King. Philip is the king that saw the weaknesses and the wealth of the Knights Templar as an opportunity. So he's the one who organized bogus charges against them in order to destroy the order and seize all their property in France. And those trumped up charges and that sensational trial of the Templars led to all of those phony conspiracy theories that are still with us today. Philip's hard-nosed dealings with the church extended to the papacy. A plan of his to tax and to take control of all church property in France led to a violent confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII. During that conflict, to everyone in Europe's surprise and dismay, French forces attacked the papal residence and they captured the person of the Pope. He was then held for 3 days and he died a month later. Following that same playbook that he would later use to destroy the Templars, Philip pressured the Pope's successor, Clement V, to hold a posthumous trial for Pope Boniface on charges of heresy and sodomy. And while there was no substantive evidence and there was no verdict in that trial, Philip was able to successfully pressure the new Pope, Clement, to relocate papal headquarters from Rome to Avignon, down the river here from Lyon, where he and later kings of France found the papacy much easier to manipulate and control. So it's this king of France, Philip the Fair, who incorporated Lyon into his kingdom in 1312, just 2 years before his own death. And this was the beginning of the end for Western Europe's lost Middle Kingdom. Living as we do, centuries after the invention of the idea of nationalism, and also after centuries of the very intentional creation and promotion of the idea of being French, including policies that standardize the language here and cause people to conform to spoken French within the boundaries so that it conforms to the language of Paris, while deliberately seeking to eradicate the language that had historically been spoken here in Lyon, which is called either Lyonnaise or Franco-Provençal or Arpitan. So with our post-nationalist perspective, it might seem natural that Lyon is part of France, since it's full of French people. Just like the nation of Italy eventually brought together and unified most states that were understood to be Italian. But there's no essential reason why everything had to end up this way. When central authority in the Western Roman Empire collapsed and spoken Latin, which already had many dialects that differed from classical written Latin, when it began to evolve in multiple different directions more rapidly, eventually becoming modern Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, etc., None of those endpoints were guaranteed at the outset. Indeed, when we think about it just for a second, we realize, well, there are other Romance languages that exist and are spoken at the subnational level. The most obvious example is the Catalan language spoken in Catalonia, which is the city of Barcelona and its vicinity. In fact, the Romance languages that evolved out of Latin were not marching together in the modern nation-state boundaries. Rather, all of the local dialects differed, and there was a spectrum from the medieval French, spoken at the royal court in Paris, to the medieval Provençal, spoken in Marseille. And medieval Provençal had much in common with medieval Catalan, which then, in turn, differed from medieval Castilian Spanish. The Italian poet Dante identified the differences in local vernacular languages based on what word people use to say yes. So he says, some people say "ac," others say "si," while others say "wheel." So wheel becomes, it continues to evolve and becomes "oui" or "ouais," which is the way Parisians say yes, oui. Si, the way you say yes in Italian, Spanish, and Catalan. And then "ac" was the way you said yes in Provençal and other languages of what is now southern France, including Lyonnese. And so these languages came to be known as the langue d'oc, literally the languages where you say oak. That is also called Occitan or Occitan, from the oak. And so while the nation of France has been quite successful at eradicating Occitan, so all of the dialects are now considered endangered or severely endangered by UNESCO, history did not have to go this way. I could just as easily be speaking to you today from Lyon in the modern nation of Occitania or Aquitaine or Burgundy instead of France. And depending how a few quirks might have played out differently in the Middle Ages, if that had happened, if Aquitaine had emerged in the 19th century as a nation state, then the Occitan language would have taken its place on par with French and Italian. We can't know what might have been, but we can look at what was. Let's look at the Middle Kingdom of the Franks and why it fell. The Franks were one of the Germanic confederations that displaced the Roman military and the Roman imperial government here in what had been the Western Roman Empire after the collapse of the imperial center. Beginning across the frontier in Franconia, in Germany, they crossed the Rhine and took many Roman border cities like Trier and Cologne. And eventually they established themselves across the lower middle countries, so the middle low countries, that is, especially modern Belgium, and then further west into what is now northern France. Another Germanic confederation called the Burgundians crossed the Rhine and settled here in the region in and around Lyon. Lyon, Roman Lugdunum, had been the capital of Gaul, and the city, along with its downriver neighbor and rival Vienne, became capitals of the Burgundian kingdom, which grew to encompass several former Roman provinces. In this time period, Germanic kingship was personal, and so your kingdom, the dominion of the king, consisted of not lands, but of people. which is how kingdoms like that of the Vandals moved so much. So they started in Germany, they went to Italy, they came here to Gaul and then Spain before finally settling down permanently in North Africa in modern-day Tunisia. In addition, kingship was not passed by primogeniture. That is to say, the way we understand kingdoms today, like Britain, where Queen Elizabeth's firstborn son, King Charles, inherited her throne, and his firstborn son, Prince William, is his heir. Germanic confederations were more like war bands, and the kings were like war chiefs who were needed to lead all of the warriors into battle. And so if a war chief dies, at least initially, you didn't want to have to wait around until his infant son grows up to have a new war chief to lead you into battle. You need a king who can lead you into battle now. Nor did you necessarily need to have only one successor. Frequently, Germanic kingdoms then would be divided into multiple rulers, which almost certainly inevitably led to civil wars, as the different kings, who were often brothers or nephew, uncle, or cousins, they fought each other for paramount control of the confederation. So, for example, when the Burgundian king Gundioch died in 472, the throne passed to his brother, King Chilperic I. But when Chilperic died the next year, the Burgundian kingdom was divided into 4 pieces, as each of the former king Gundioch's sons, his 4 adult sons, became king of their own little territory. So Chilperic II had his capital at Valence. Godegisel was based in Geneva. Gundamar held court in Vienne. And Gundobad's capital was here in Lyon. So after much warfare, Gundobad of Lyon defeated his brothers one by one, and by the year 480, he was recognized as king of all of the Burgundians. Despite its general instability, this system of inheritance continued for centuries in Germanic kingship, all the way up through the end of the early Middle Ages. In addition to civil wars, Germanic kingdoms fought each other. So the Franks, who were north of here, sought to ally with the Burgundians against the Visigoths, who were in the southwest. And that led the Frankish king, Clovis I, to marry a Burgundian princess named Clotilda in the year 493. Like the contemporary Angles and Saxons who were invading Britain in the 5th century, the Franks had remained pagans. That is, Clovis and his warriors still worshipped the old Germanic gods, gods like Woden and Donar and Zeu. Burgundians had already converted to Christianity generations earlier. But like the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, the version of Christianity that they had embraced was Arianism. Okay, this is Arianism with an I, and it has nothing to do with the 20th century racist movement of Arianism with a Y. It's a totally different thing. So Arians with an I are Christians who reject the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity, and instead they accept a Christology formulated by a 3rd century priest named Arius. Arius had taught that while Christ, yes, is the divine Son of God, he nevertheless is not co-eternal with God the Father. Instead, Arius taught that at some point Christ had come into existence, so when he was begotten of the Father. Nicene Christians, by contrast, understand Christ is eternal, and he's therefore co-eternal with the Father, believing that Christ is eternally being begotten in the divine present. So this isn't something that simply was confined to one temporal moment in the past. So this is all very arcane stuff, but for practical purposes, this meant that the Germanic peoples who ruled over various parts of the former West Roman Empire were out of communion with their subjects and with the Latin Church Episcopate, the bishops, including the bishops of Rome, the popes. So unlike the rest of her family and the Burgundian court, who were all Arians, Princess Clotilda was a Nicene Christian. Her persistence ultimately wore down the pagan Frankish king Clovis's resistance, and so on Christmas Day he converted and was baptized in the year 508. Most of the other Frankish nobles followed his example, meaning that the Franks, alone among all of the Germanic leaders, became Nicene Christians and were thus in communion with their Roman subjects and the papacy. And so this eventually would allow the Franks to form a more effective alliance with the papacy than the other Germanic groups. So ultimately, the first Burgundian kingdom here proved short-lived. Princess Clotilda was a daughter of King Chilperic II, who was murdered at the behest of his brother Gundobad's behest. You know, that same Gundobad I was mentioning, who went off and defeated all of his brother and became paramount king, he murdered her dad. Later, as Clotilda, as the queen of the Franks, she encouraged her sons to avenge her father's murder by attacking Gundobad's son, King Gundamir II. So they succeeded in defeating the Burgundians at the Battle of Autun in 432. Thereafter, Gundamir was killed and Burgundy was fully incorporated into the Frankish kingdom. So the Franks also succeeded in driving the Visigoths out of Aquitaine and secured then most all of Gaul for themselves, saving only a thin coastal strip, Septimania, down on the Mediterranean. King Clovis was the grandson of a legendary Frankish king named Merovich. And Merovich gave his name to the original Frankish royal family, the Merovingians. This family ruled the Frankish kingdom from the middle of the 5th century until the year 751. But the rules of succession were much like those of the Burgundians, meaning that the kingdom was often divided among multiple Merovingian kings. And just as often, those kings were fighting deadly civil wars with one another. Infighting among rival brothers and cousins made being a Merovingian prince or king a very dangerous profession, and eventually this led to a series of reigns by increasingly younger and younger kings, actually boy kings. And when that happened, effective power slowly transferred to other court officials. So increasingly, authority was wielded by the king's chief official, or major domo. That's Latin, and it literally means mayor of the palace, the major domo. And one of these mayors of the palace, Charles Martel, distinguished himself at the Battle of Tours, which is also known as the Battle of Poitiers, in 732, when he defeated an invading army from Muslim Spain. So in retrospect, this battle has been seen as arresting the tide of Islamic conquests that had rolled all across Christian Egypt and North Africa to Spain and really threatened to engulf all of Europe. So Charles Martel put a stop to that, and his son, Pepin the Short, inherited his great authority. By this time, the last Merovingian king was a mere figurehead, And when Pepin wrote to the Pope asking the question, it's kind of a pointed question, should not the one who has the power also wear the crown? The Carolingian sources, anyway, said that he receives a favorable response. And so the symbol of the Merovingian dynasty's royalty had been their long hair. And so Pepin unceremoniously had King Childeric III's hair shorn, and he sent him off to live out his days in a monastery. Pepin then assumed the crown, establishing a new royal dynasty, the Carolingians. This was also the beginning of a mutual alliance between the Carolingians and the papacy. And so Roman Italy, way back at the fall of the Western Empire, had originally fallen to the Ostrogoths. But when the peninsula was devastated anew, when the East Roman Emperor Justinian destroyed the Ostrogothic kingdom in a series of destructive wars, then subsequently, the East Romans lost the bulk of Italy to the next round of Germanic invaders, led by the Lombard Confederacy. But while the Lombards successfully established themselves in the north of Italy, the area now known as Lombardy, outposts like Venice and Ravenna and Naples and Rome, they retained their autonomy. They weren't conquered by the Lombards, and they were nominally anyway, still under the rule of the East Roman emperors in Constantinople. So by necessity, the popes became the effective rulers of the area around Rome, which was continually threatened by Lombard encroachment. Constant papal pleas for military reinforcements from the emperors in Constantinople fell on deaf ears. The Byzantines just had too many problems of their own on all fronts nearer to home, and so it's little wonder that Pope Stephen II turned to his old friend, now King Pepin of the Franks, for help. Hey, he said, hey, remember how Pope Zachary gave you the go-ahead to become king? Well, how about you return the favor by knocking some Lombard heads together? So Pepin duly intervened in Italy, forcing the king of the Lombards to give up territory he had recently conquered from the Duchy of Rome. Pepin then donated this territory to the papacy, and that becomes the real legal origin of the Papal States. In the next generation, when the Lombards threatened the Papal States once again, Pope Hadrian I called for help from Pepin's son Charles, who led a large Frankish army into Italy and conquered the Lombard kingdom once and for all in the year 774. This Frankish king, known for his many conquests and for his general greatness as Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, was later crowned emperor of the revived Western Empire by Pope Hadrian's successor, Pope Leo III. So the alliance now between the Carolingians and the papacy has become total, and the latter effectively broke any pretense of being subject to Constantinople. After many conquests, Charlemagne expanded the Frankish Empire to incorporate nearly all of continental Western Christendom, from the March of Spain in the southwest to Saxony in the north, to the plains of Pannonia, what's now Hungary in the east, and all of this then is the context and the backdrop for understanding Middle Francia and its fate. In addition to inheriting the Frankish kingdom from their predecessors, the Merovingians, the Carolingian dynasty inherited the Frankish practice of dividing up the kingship. So towards the end of his own reign, Pepin the Short had two adult sons, Charlemagne and Charlemagne's younger brother, Carloman. And so he had them anointed as kings during his own lifetime. And when Pepin died in 768, the realm was partitioned into two. Carloman exercised kingship here in Burgundy and in Provence and Alemannia. But Charlemagne ruled kind of the Frankish homeland of Austrasia and also then a ring of coastal territories along the North Sea, the Channel, and the Atlantic. It was only when Carloman unexpectedly died in 771 that Charlemagne was able to take control of the entire realm. So toward the end of Charlemagne's long reign, he likewise planned to divide his realm, and he issued a document, the Divisio Regnorum, in the year 806. His eldest son, Charles the Younger, was to inherit the bulk of the realm, so Austrasia, Neustria, along with Saxony, while his younger son, Louis the Pious, would be made king of Aquitania, and Pepin of Italy would be king of Italy. But both Charles the Younger and Pepin died before Charlemagne did, which allowed Louis the Pious to be crowned co-emperor in his father's lifetime and then to succeed to the whole realm upon Charlemagne's death in 814. Louis the Pious once again had several sons who were made kings over territories during his lifetime, and once again this led to civil wars as they jockeyed for power and position and also sometimes sought to depose their own father. So by the time Louis died in 840, 3 of these royal sons were left. The youngest, named Charles, known as Charles the Bald in history, was already serving as king in Aquitaine, the western part of Francia. The middle son, Louis, known in history as Louis the German, was king in Bavaria and the eastern part of Francia. And finally, the eldest son, Lothair, controlled Lombardy. And so Lothar had already been crowned co-emperor in his father's lifetime, although he had been deposed a couple times because of rebellions that he had against his father. So on his deathbed, though, Louis the Pious sent the imperial insignia to Lothair, who he sought to succeed him to the entire realm. That plan, though, did not sit well with his brothers, who raised armies and got together in an alliance. The 3 met at the Battle of Fontenoy, where Lothar's forces were decisively defeated. Hostilities then dragged on until a peace was ratified in 843 at Verdun, partitioning the Frankish Empire into 3 pieces. Louis the German who is now remembered as Louis II of Germany, received East Francia, which now began its slow evolution into Germany. Charles the Bald, King Charles II of France, received West Francia, which is now on track to evolve into modern France. And the hapless Lothar received the Middle Kingdom. And so he already had his Lombard connections, so he has Italy. And as the sitting emperor of the West, it made sense for him to retain Rome. But he also kept Charlemagne's northern imperial center at Aachen. And then in between, Lothar was able to retain a thin swath of rich territory that included this area in the south, eastern Burgundy, including Lyon and Vienne. And then in the north, lands that began to take their name from him, Lothringia, which now we think of as Lorraine, Lothringia. Of course, his realm was not defensible compared to the eastern and western kingdoms, leaving Lothair in the weakest position despite his imperial title. 12 years after Verdun, Lothair died, and then his realm was partitioned among his sons. The eldest, Louis II, became emperor, and he received Italy. Lothar II received Lothringia, and a third son, Charles, received Burgundy and Provence. And then when he died without issue, his kingdom was partitioned between his brothers. From this point on, various components of Lothar's middle kingdom were up for grabs, as it were. Charles the Bald in West Francia proved temporarily successful at nabbing it all. After his nephew, the Emperor Louis II of Italy, died, Charles takes control of his realm, and he is ultimately crowned emperor by the Pope. But Charles dies only 2 years after that. And his son and grandsons, they're able to retain West Francia as they're fighting with the Capetians, but they've lost control of this middle kingdom. In 870, Charles the Bald had married a noblewoman named Richelda, whose brother Bozo rose very high in the imperial administration, serving as chamberlain of the imperial court. He was later given the rank of duke and made a governor. And in 877, after the emperor's death, Bozo maneuvered between the various claimants to the many thrones, and he was able, in 879, audaciously, he had himself elected king of Provence and of Lower Burgundy. Bozo declared independence and claimed to rule his kingdom by the grace of God. So in doing so, he became the very first non-Carolingian to rule anywhere as a Christian king in continental Western Europe in more than a century. Additional wrangling among the many Carolingian successors then led to a final reconsolidation of the entire realm under the youngest of Louis the German's sons, Charles III, known as Charles the Fat, and he became emperor in 881. Charles' forces successfully retook most of King Bozo's kingdom here, restricting Bozo to the county of Vienne, and that's about it. Otherwise, Charles the Fat, though, lacked the capacities of his great-grandfather Charlemagne, and his realm was now beset on all sides and also from within. So he was forced twice to buy off huge Viking armies at great cost, including during the famous siege of Paris in 886. Ultimately, his nephew, Arnulf of Carinthia, led a successful coup against him, and this led to the permanent breakup of the Frankish Empire. The Carolingians were now in rapid decline. The coup plotter, Arnulf of Carinthia, took control of East Francia, the German part of the kingdom, and was succeeded by his son, Louis the Child. After Louis passed away at the age of 17 in the year 911, East Francia elected Conrad, the Duke of Franconia, as their king. This ended Carolingian rule in Germany. West Francia, meanwhile, had elected Count Odo of Paris as their king. Odo was part of the Robertine family, the ancestors of the Capetians who would go on to be the royal dynasty of the Kingdom of France. Although the kingship in the West now alternated between the Robertines, these proto-Capetians, and the Carolingians, the last few kings of Charlemagne's dynasty, who go by the names like Charles the Simple, Louis from overseas, and there was one last Lothar, and then finally we have Louis, called Louis the Do-Nothing. These were not successful examples of kingship, and so royal power in the West, in the kingdom that became France, steadily contracted. King Bozo's son, here in Burgundy, became king of Provence upon his father's death in 887, when he was just a 7-year-old boy. So he was fortunate in that his mother, Ermengarde, was a Carolingian princess who was able to successfully have his status as a king recognized by her relatives. And so when Louis of Provence came of age, his authority slowly gained from the area just around Vienne and around here in Lyon to include all of the Kingdom of Provence and Lower Burgundy. The breakup of the empire left a power vacuum in Italy, which was suffering also from raids by the Magyars. In the year 900, a faction of Italian nobles invited Louis of Provence to bring his army there to become King of Italy. He did so, and he was duly crowned emperor in 901 in Rome by Pope Benedict IV. However, Louis was unable to stem the raids of the Magyars nor to provide any effective control in the increasingly chaotic Kingdom of Italy. A Frankish nobleman named Berengar, the Marquis of Friuli, who had also previously claimed the throne of Italy for himself, led a successful revolt against Louis's rule, and Louis was forced to flee Italy, and he swore an oath that he'd never return there. A few years later, in 905, Louis allowed himself to be talked into trying again. Let's give it another go. He led a new army from here in the Burgundian kingdom and took Italy, taking control of Pavia, the Lombard capital, and Verona. Berengar fled, but then he returned with a reinforcing army from Bavaria. Louis was outnumbered and he was captured, and this time Berengar had his men put Louis's eyes out for breaking his oath. So Louis returned here to the Kingdom of Provence and Burgundy, where he is known as King Louis the Blind. Temporarily secure in his kingship of Italy, Berengar had himself crowned emperor. So the title of emperor now in the West has fallen again on very hard times and is essentially hollow, as increasingly localized leaders are jockeying for this hollow title. Meanwhile, in his blinded condition, Louis's power gets actually concentrated in the hands of one of his chief noblemen, Count Hugh of Arles. And when the Italians once again revolt against Berengar, Hugh of Arles now leads an army there in order to fight in their civil war. Berengar is killed, and the following year in 926, Hugh of Arles is elected King of Italy. And then when Louis the Blind dies here in 928, Hugh is able to seize the crown of Provence and Lower Burgundy too, passing over Louis the Blind's son. So I've been talking a while about the kingdom of Lower Burgundy. That is the part of Burgundy down here in the lowlands. But during the reign of Louis the Blind, Upper Burgundy, the part that's north of here up in the mountains, had also been part of Lothar's Middle Francia, and now had it emerged as its own independent kingdom, which was ruled by members of a dynasty known as the Old Welfs. The Welfs ultimately become one of the ruling dynasties in Germany. They're known in Italian as the Guelphs, and so a much later cadet branch of the Welfs, the House of Hanover, eventually provides monarchs for the United Kingdom. So the second of these Welf kings, Rudolf II, was also vying to become King of Italy in the 920s. And so Hugh of Arles had been trying to become King of Upper Burgundy. So the two of them were in a lot of conflict, but they came to an agreement in 933. So Hugh ceded this whole area, Lower Burgundy, to Rudolf, in exchange for Rudolf giving up any claim to Italy or the imperial crown. And so when that happened, the Second Kingdom of Burgundy came together and achieved its height. All right, so there's so much chaos in the 10th century. Hopefully you forgive me for going down this rabbit hole of details. But it's interesting because, okay, there's something else happened. Hugh of Arles, now given a free hand in Italy, decides to marry Marozia. So Marozia was the widow of the Duke of Spoleto, and she was the effective ruler of Rome. She had been given the unprecedented titles of senatrix, that is to say female senator, and patricia, that is female patrician. These were the leading secular titles for the ruler of Rome. And so she's given those by Pope John X. And so allegedly, Marozia had been the mistress of Pope Sergius III, and their illegitimate child, her son anyway, became Pope John XI. During his reign, his mother was really the person that held effective rule over both the city of Rome and the church. So two of Marozia's grandsons, two of her great-grandsons, and one of her great-great-grandsons all held the throne of St. Peter during what is inarguably one of the lowest moments in the history of the papacy. This is the time period and possibly the source of the myth of Pope Joan, this widespread but false idea that there was once a female pope in the Middle Ages. So we're going to have to do a lecture on this time period in Rome. Maybe we'll do it next year when we plan to spend a month in Rome. Let's get now to the aftermath. What happened to the Middle Kingdom once it had effectively been split into three components? Lothringia, Lorraine in the north, Burgundy, Provence here in the center, and Italy in the south. In West Francia, which became France, the Capetian dynasty took control of the crown and succeeded in making the monarchy hereditary instead of elective by continually producing an heir and associating him in the kingship during his father's lifetime. So while the Capetians were really good at doing that, they otherwise presided over a steady decline in royal power as the great nobles in and around them built up effectively autonomous states in Normandy, in Flanders, in Anjou, in Blois-Champagne, Toulouse, and Aquitaine. The Dukes of Aquitaine were removed enough from court and held a territory that had historically housed kings, and so it's really only happenstance that none of them ever was able to take a crown for themselves and created a kingdom of Aquitaine, which would have changed history. The Capetians controlled their own part of Burgundy, the northeastern part, known as the Duchy of Burgundy, but they otherwise were largely out of contention for controlling the middle kingdoms. So in other words, the Kingdom of Burgundy or Lorraine, until their fortunes turned around in the 13th century. In East Francia, which became Germany by contrast, kingship continued to be elective, and its kings initially continued to be very powerful rulers. So in the year 936, Otto I, known as Otto the Great, the Duke of Saxony, was elected King of Germany. For half a century, the Duchy of Lothringia, Lorraine, had been passing between the East Frankish and West Frankish rulership. After successfully intervening in West Frankish affairs, Otto was able to force its king to permanently cede any claim of suzerainty over Lorraine in the year 942. A decade later, in 955, Otto decisively defeated the Magyars in battle, putting a final end to their tradition of raiding Germany and Italy. And if we return now to the story that had been going on in Italy, so Berengar the first son, Berengar II, had successfully led a revolt against Hugh of Orleans. He retired shortly before his death in favor of his son, who was crowned as King Lothar II of Italy. Soon after, Lothair died unexpectedly, probably being poisoned, and Berengar II seized the crown and hoped to consolidate his role by marrying Lothar's widow, Queen Adelaide, who was herself a Burgundian princess. Anyway, she was being besieged by Berengar's men in a sort of a hostile courtship. She was in her castle in Canossa, and she sent messengers to King Otto in Germany, asking him to intervene. Otto responded by leading an army into Italy. So Berengar realized he was totally outnumbered, and he fled. And Otto's men seized the Lombard capital, Pavia, and he had himself crowned King of Italy. He himself then wed Queen Adelaide. And so after years more fighting, Otto eventually made good that title and took effective control of Italy. He came to Rome at the head of an army in 962, and so Pope John XII had little alternative but to crown Otto the emperor. However, the Pope did not like this idea of a new, strong, effective emperor, and so he sought allies to help rid Italy of these Germans. And he even sent envoys to the Magyars of all people, and he also sent envoys to Constantinople. All the envoys were intercepted, and the emperor responded by summoning a council. It arrested the Pope and deposed him in a trial in 963. Otto appointed a much more effective pope than had been happening in the last century, seemingly, Leo VIII. And this began a process of papal reform that ultimately led, ironically, to the Gregorian reform movement and the development of a theory of papal supremacy. That, in the end, challenged and destroyed the rule of the Western emperors, the Holy Roman emperors. Meanwhile, though, having successfully incorporated Lorraine and Italy into his empire, all that remained of the lost Middle Kingdom was Burgundy, Provence, which for a time was then still ruled by the kings of the elder house of the Welfs. But that house's last legitimate heir, King Rudolf III, was himself childless at the beginning of the 11th century. And so Germany's elective kingship passed from the Ottonians to a new dynasty, the Salians. And the Emperor Conrad II, who also had a grandmother who was a Burgundian princess, he felt that he had a claim on Burgundy, and he intervened, forcing Rudolf III to name him as his heir. So when Rudolf died in 1032, Conrad marched an army here to Burgundy and took possession of the Middle Kingdom, incorporating the last little bit of the Middle Kingdom of Francia into the German-controlled Holy Roman Empire. The long conflict between the papacy and the empire had by this time begun to simmer. Both the popes and the Holy Roman emperors claimed theoretical sovereignty over all of Christendom, which in practice led to mortal combat between the two. Ultimately, the popes were able to work with the emperor's many rebellious vassals to undermine royal authority in all three of his kingdoms. Effective authority was lost first in Italy, which dissolved into city-states and autonomous duchies. And then it was lost here in Burgundy and Provence, which followed suit. Eventually, of course, the Holy Roman Empire in Germany fractured into hundreds of quasi-independent states as royal authority lapsed almost completely. So, in this state of affairs, Lyon had effectively become an independent city-state by the beginning of the 14th century, and it was only nominally part of an empire. King Philip the Fair, quick to sense a weakness in a rickety traditional structure, he had previously forced Count Henry of Luxembourg in Lorraine, one of these other northern part of the Middle Kingdom, to become his vassal in order to protect Luxembourg from Henry's enemies. So when Henry then was later elected King of Germany, he was really in no position to stop Philip from annexing Lyon, which he did in April of 1312. Just a few months later, Henry of Luxembourg was in Rome, being crowned Emperor Henry VII by the French Pope Clement V, that very Pope who moved the papacy to Avignon. So the ideal of universal empire ran aground on practical realities. Ultimately, the power of both the popes and the emperors was already in steep decline relative to the rising kings of the new emerging states that ultimately became nation states, led by Philip IV, Philip the Fair in the vanguard. And so today, I'm in Lyon, in the nation state of France. Yet, it didn't have to be so. Any number of other possible futures could have happened. There could have been other nation states. I might just as easily have been joining you from the nation of Burgundy or the nation of Provence or Aquitaine. Thank you.
I don't know if I can get this to work right. Hello. I think this is on and working. Good to see everybody. This was a lot of fun. We were able to do our second one of these walking around lectures where I get my steps in, and it's not the same as when we can have all the slides, but this time we were able to get some of the maps in because there were so many lands and details. And so hopefully you were able to follow all of that, but it's a fun topic anyway. These what might have beens as different happenstances of history might have led different directions to have ended up in our modern nation states that we have. So I want to start off by thanking people who donated. And so thanks to JM and Dartharama, and thanks to Dave Anderson. And my mic is turned down, maybe? I don't know. It's on. Maybe turned on total. Turns down on its own. I'm doing what I can. So there we are. And so thank you so much for your support. Let's have some of the comments and questions that you guys have been saying. So Kalo Arapol said that they believe the medieval German epic, the Nibelungenlied, from which Wagner got his opera, derives from the early Burgundian kingdom. And I think that Michael Luce was saying that that's the case too. And I think that what I understand is that Siegfried, who's one of the character there, is trying to win the hand of Kriemhild, who is another one of these Burgundian princesses. So we saw how many times Burgundian princesses really entered into this history. The Burgundians did a good job of marrying off their daughters to other noble houses. And so that's part of the Nibelungenlied too. Michael Luce pointed out that the Battle of Autun was in 532, not 432. That is correct. So running around with some of those dates. But Michael also says, or Michelle also says, wasn't the evolution in terms of Germanic kingships from the war bands to elected kings to fixed territories, didn't that evolution naturally, wasn't that responsible for what caused the hereditary rules as opposed to an elective rule? And Michelle was pointing out that primogeniture comes much later, or it doesn't always come in every one of these monarchies. So yeah, you also pointed out, I think, in other cases that, just because you get a fixed territory, like Poland, it doesn't mean you necessarily moved to a hereditary monarchy. You could still maintain the tradition of an elective monarchy the way that the Holy Roman Empire more or less did, although at a certain point the Habsburgs were successful at keeping it in the family. But even so, when they got to a place where the they didn't have a son, the heiress was Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria and Hungary. The elective nature of the Holy Roman Empire kicked in, and so sometimes you can have a territorial monarchy that is nevertheless remains elective. Other supporters, thank you so much to Daryl Scott, to Mike R., and to Tim DeMoss. We really appreciate all of the support that everyone gives. This allows us to devote a bunch of time we have to doing things that we love doing, but your support makes it possible. Gnostic Informant had said that Ed Watts told me in 1806, told me that 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire was extinguished by Napoleon, that should be taken just as seriously as for the date of the fall of Rome as the fall of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, to the Turk in 1453, or the technical end of the emperorship in the West in 476. And Gnostic Informant says that depends on how we define Rome. And so that led to a good discussion in the comments. How do we define Rome? I think we had a lecture a long time ago that was like, did Rome ever really fall? There was the Rome and a lot of its components, what constituted Rome, things like law, the Roman law, and the Latin language, other kinds of things that maybe were kind of critical, that existed before there was the institution of the emperor. And so just the fact that the institution of the emperor ended in the West in 476, that doesn't necessarily mean that what it meant to be Rome ended everywhere else, just because the kings of these Germanic confederations were now occupying the place where the emperor had been. There were still all of these underlying components of Roman provincial administration in Latin as the main written language and everything like that, the church structure that had filled in and emerged as part of what it meant to be the empire in the later centuries, that was all still perfectly existing in these Germanic confederations. And so people made the case for, well, what about to the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when the Habsburgs got toppled, or the papacy, which is ongoing, the Ottomans, the Tsars? There's all kinds of ways that what it meant to be Rome continued. Parasocial Audience says, why is the Emperor Otto I considered the first Holy Roman Emperor? When, in fact, obviously there had been a revival of the Western Empire with Charlemagne. And so both Charlemagne and then the Carolingians, as we saw, continued to maintain the imperial crown. And then even after the Carolingians started getting displaced, we also saw that local officials like Berengar, were trying to Friuli, were assuming the imperial crown, even though they could barely control just even northern Italy, and so in a sense, Otto is there is a little bit of an interregnum. So there is this time period where the title lapses, and then it now gets started up again with the Ottonians, where it then remains vested with the what we think of now as the Kingdom of Germany. But the monarchy was, you would get elected to be king of the Romans, and that would be the Germans, really. But anyway, king of the Romans, and then you would get crowned by the Pope. And so the details of that sort of evolved out of Otto. But I kind of agree with you that Otto, in some ways, is also a transition from the earlier revival under the Carolingians of the West Roman Empire. but it's when we start calling it the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, just like the word phrase Byzantine Empire, is not what people called that historically. That's what historians use to refer to that entity in order to have a distinction from the previous Roman Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, which continue to be called Roman Empire, but historians use them the phrase Holy Roman Empire to make that distinction. Kalo Arepo says, was Marozia, this really fascinating woman who was in charge of the city of Rome here at this dark period of the Middle Ages, was she Pope Joan? So she's probably potentially the source of the legend of Pope Joan. This Pope Joan legend is largely popularized by Protestants who would like to undercut the idea, one of the pillars of authority that is maintained within Catholic and Orthodox tradition, which is the idea of apostolic continuity. And so if you could stick a woman in there, that means that there's no legitimacy. So nowadays, now that we would like to have more gender equality and we would like to identify women leaders, having a Pope Joan, people would like a Pope Joan from a positive reason. Where that myth got created and got popularized, it's a very antagonistic to women story. But the real historical character, Marozia, that might actually be a story of an actual woman who is in authority in a particular time, that could be looked at for whatever positive messages that can come out of that, wherever they were at that time period in terms of maybe some evolution in what gender roles were for the noble leaders. Josh Bedford asks, what got me interested in the history of the Middle Ages? So I've always been interested in history since I was very young. What got me especially interested in both ancient history and medieval history, when I was a little kid, I loved maps, and I continue to be a map maker. You saw maps all over this lecture, and so I had a historical atlas as one of my main books that I pored over, when I was 5 and 6 and 7. And that included, it was a Hammond World Atlas, and it included an entire kind of atlas of world history. It's mostly focused on European history, of course, from, since it's a 1960s atlas. And so I would just pore over that and look at what all of these old kingdoms were. And I would be interested in reading about, the Holy Roman Empire and Burgundy and Lothringia and the Papal States and all those things. And those maps really got me interested in it. And then later, when I became a teenager, I started reading, fantasy novels like Tolkien and things like that. And that also then, I liked that for popular reading. And then I also got interested in reading actual history. Adorabella Perfecta says, are there any cool facts about the basis of the word Lorraine? And can you tell us anything about the history of the cross of Lorraine? So the basis of the word Lorraine is, like I was saying, I kept on calling it Lothringia Lorraine. So in French, you tend to stop pronouncing a lot of different letters as French continues to be long words, although they'll get rid of S's by putting a circumflex over some of the vowels, so they'll delete some of them, but they just stop pronouncing some of the letters. And so the territory is literally called Lothringia because that's the area that is owned by Lothair, or was given to Lothair. And so then as you delete letters out of Lothringia, you get to Lorraine. And so that's where that word comes from. Lorraine is just a shortened of Lothringia. And in terms of the cross, I don't think that the name has anything to do with it. It's a matter of there's just different cross symbols that develop everywhere, from the cross of Jerusalem, the Maltese cross, Celtic cross, the cross of Lorraine. So we have gotten a lot of likes. We're to 88 likes so far. If you guys press like now, we will get past 100 even, and that will have more people watching this late at night here in Europe and in the regular evening in North America. Daryl Scott says, which of all of these many historical people that I mentioned is my favorite? um, well, I mean, I mean, as just an intriguing person in history who accomplished more than you would have imagined. I mean, he's the standout of all of this time in history is Charlemagne. And so Charlemagne is an interesting character, and you could continue to talk about him all of the time. And so he's certainly probably the odds on favorite out of all of these. I'm trying to think of like out of these interesting characters. I was just amazed by this career of Hugh of Arles, who was just a nobleman in the kingdom um, of Burgundy, Provence here, who, when his king had been blinded, was able to kind of worm his way up and kind of take control of the realm, become the war leader, go to Italy, make himself king there, and ultimately, get involved in, marry Marozia, get involved in all of the craziest politics of all of this. And so that was certainly an interesting, scandalous story. Um, Another, uh, great, person who brings things out of, kind of a lower point and, and reestablishes authority is, again, Otto the Great, who was able to revive, the authority of this empire that has been in a state of collapse, and get things going. And this is one of the reasons why he's thought of as being as the start of the Holy Roman Empire. So there's several of these that are very interesting. This is not my my number one time period. So my favorite era of the Middle Ages is the 11th century, and it's just filled with people who I know very, very well indeed. Nitsky89 says, why did most of the Germans initially convert to Arian Christianity? I was told that it fit better with the German idea of kingship, or it was a conscious effort to separate themselves from their Roman subjects. So I think that the reason why is that that there was an Arian that there were Arian missionaries who went to Germany, and they'd actually also I think they'd also done a good job of like translating stories into Gothic and things like that, so that they were actively meeting the people where they were. And so I think that it's actually just kind of a happenstance that sort of exiled Arian missionaries ended up converting them. And then, like you say, once they were Arians, the fact that they had this little bit of difference from the Romans meant that they could kind of say, well, you guys, it's like one of these cultural things where it's clear that the Romans have had a higher civilization, culture, technology, all of these kind of things. But then you can say to them, but you guys all have it wrong. We're all Christians, but we know the truth. We have the real way of doing it. So I think that at that point it did become sort of a conscious way of trying to maintain your own culture and say that you're better than the people you've conquered. You're also better than them because you conquered them, right? So you have that going. And so then over time, the usefulness of that waned, and so the before they got overthrown, the Visigoths in Spain ended up converting away from Arianism, as we saw. Clotilda of Burgundy also ended up converting, and so people. It wasn't necessarily going to last forever, but it was meaningful for them in the beginning. Filippo, thank you for your support. Roan Wagner says, weren't there more wars between France and Germany over the territory of Lorraine. Yes, absolutely. So when I said that Otto got them to cede it, I meant to say that you give up your rights to it. It doesn't mean that people that the French stopped ever trying to get parts of it back. They did. So I mentioned how, for example, by the time we're getting to the end of this, the last vestiges of this Middle Kingdom, that Philip the Fair, Philip the Fourth, had started intervening back and trying to make Luxembourg, for example, to be his vassal. So that ended up being the entire thrust of Louis the XIV's goal was to simply push as hard as he could into what's now Belgium and things like that. And it was just an amazingly difficult slog to conquer. He hardly conquered anything compared to how much work and money he put into it. But yeah, they were then, once the Capetians recovered from their woes and their low point and really got the proto-nation state building, then they definitely started pushing in that direction, and they fought over it all the way up until Alsace-Lorraine, right? So up until the Franco-Prussian War and beyond. Fastball Flakes, 104 likes. Thank you, Hammerheads, he says. Thank you, Fastball Flakes, for your support. Max Santanax says, what role did the church play in encouraging the fragmenting of these kingdoms? I think actually the church largely was in favor of consolidating the kingdom. So I think that the church would have preferred. I think the church preferred the sort of stability, and they preferred having an empire, and they wanted to have order and hierarchy. And so that was actually a thing that, so for example, the Viking kings were one of the reasons why they converted from Norse paganism to Christianity, was that they were able to move from being a kind of a chieftain of a war band to suddenly having a hereditary monarchy that was unified, that the church was prepared to support. So you had an institution that is focusing on that. So I think that the this Germanic thing of wanting to split the kingdom up into bits for the different, because you have different war chief sons or cousins that are all able to lead. I think that is something that they were doing naturally, and that it wasn't necessarily the church that was causing that. Operation Ivy 85 said, did the Ostrogoths or the other kings of Italy after 476 consider themselves fully independent, or did they still recognize the Eastern Roman emperors in some way? So I think that for almost all of these Germanic kingships, when they didn't claim to be emperors initially themselves, they considered themselves to be part of Rome, and asked, and recognized that the emperor in Constantinople in some way is the technical sovereign over the whole territory, but it was entirely nominal. And so they didn't do they didn't do anything like pay tribute or anything. They would just been paying a nominal lip service to that idea. And then at some points or other, this is why that fiction could be maintained and maintained in Constantinople all the way up until the Pope crowns one of these Germanic kings, Charlemagne, as an emperor of the West. And that obviously made the Eastern emperors, very angry. And it took a long time before they started giving Byzantine princesses to, for example, Otto II, so that he could marry a Byzantine princess. And then Otto III is as a child of both empires in that way. Josephus Zeno, didn't the Franks force Christianity on the Saxons? Yes. So the Franks were not the last of the Germanic confederations to convert. I was making the point there that they're the first to convert to what we might think of as Nicene Christianity, as opposed to having become Arian Christians. And that when when the Franks, when Charlemagne and his dynasty attacked and had these great wars with the Saxons and ultimately conquered them, they forcibly Christianized them. Yes. John Williams, did they mention Martin of Tours? I did not mention Martin of Tours, who's an important figure in Gaul in kind of the early history of Christianity, Saint Martin, and there's a huge was a huge shrine that was incredibly important, especially to. I mean, it's still even to this day, but anyway, to the Merovingians and the Carolingians. And so, if we go and do, if I spend a month in Tours, we're gonna definitely have a lecture on Saint Martin, and we'll talk about Gregory of Tours, and we'll talk about all of the other interesting history that is in Touraine. Gayla Gray, why is everything deserted? So I'm walking around the streets of Lyon, and people have noticed, why are there no people in the city? And so we did come here this year in August, which is European vacation time. So a lot of people in Lyon have gone away on vacation to some other place where it's less warm. We're here because we took the vacation at this time because Leandro is on his break from seminary, and so this was a good time for us to all be able to come here. But we were also, Mike and I are waking up very early, and so we're walking around when it's still cool and when the lighting is nice, and it's also then the streets are less filled with people. Neil Gerard Fox says, are you staying in France for long? Any plans to visit here in Ireland? So we are here in France for 1 month. And so we're not quite to the midpoint, or maybe we're at the midpoint now. We're not planning on this trip anyway to go to Ireland, but of course Ireland is just filled with so much rich, amazing history, and so that would also be a place where we could easily be doing important lectures. JH asks, are you going to do a lecture on Joan of Arc? Not while I'm here, but but Joan of Arc is also a really great character we would figure to explore. I was at the Basilica on the hill here in Lyon, and there's a beautiful mosaic commemorating Joan of Arc, and so it was definitely interesting. So that's it for the for tonight and our questions. So stay tuned with us next week. We are going to talk about where's Waldo. We're going to look at Peter Waldo, the Poor of Lyon, and the Waldensian Church, a heresy that the mainline church really sought to exterminate, but which nevertheless survived, one of the earliest ones of these to actually survive. So we'll look at that. And don't forget to like and share this video, subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate everybody who's given donations. And if you, when you do that, that's really very helpful. And you can also do that in the comments afterwards, or you can go to our website, centerplace.ca/donate. Thanks so much.